6. Psychological reasons people secretly hate you. Jungian depth analysis. Have you ever noticed how someone who once admired you suddenly starts hating you for no clear reason? It feels like a silent war you never declared, but you're already losing. Carl Jung's depth psychology reveals why this happens and how it has nothing to do with who you are, but everything to do with what you awaken in others. Part 1. The phenomenon of sudden hatred in social life. Human beings often believe that love and hate are predictable, that people's emotions toward us follow a linear logic. If we are kind, people will reciprocate with kindness. If we betray or hurt them, hostility naturally follows. But in real life, this is not always the case. People can suddenly shift from admiration to disdain, from friendship to hostility, and from support to sabotage without any direct provocation. Jung's depth psychology provides a powerful lens to decode this paradox, showing that much of this sudden hatred is not about you as an individual, but about the psychological dynamics occurring in the unconscious mind, both yours, theirs. The sudden emergence of hatred is often triggered not by external actions but by internal confrontations. To Jung, the psyche is not simply a rational machine but a battlefield where unconscious conflicts constantly clash. When someone suddenly starts hating you, it may be because your presence has activated aspects of their unconscious they would rather not face. In this way, hatred is not a conscious decision, but a defense mechanism that shields them from uncomfortable truths about themselves. This can be seen in many subtle ways. Imagine a workplace where one colleague begins to excel beyond expectations. At first, others may celebrate their achievements, seeing them as inspiring. But over time, admiration turns into discomfort. Why? Because their success exposes the mediocrity of others, pulling unacknowledged insecurities to the surface. Jung would argue that this is the psyche projecting its shadow outward, the unaccepted parts of the self, the laziness, the envy, the unfulfilled ambition, find a host in the figure of the successful colleague. Hatred then becomes a shield, a way to externalize one's internal shortcomings and avoid confronting them. Jung's notion of the shadow explains this dynamic in detail. The shadow consists of everything we repress, deny, or refuse to integrate into our conscious identity. When we meet someone who embodies traits that exist in our own shadow, we are often triggered. We might despise their arrogance because deep down we repress our own desire to be assertive. We might hate their emotional intensity because we ourselves are terrified of vulnerability. In this sense, the hatred is less about the other person and more about the psychic confrontation with our disowned parts. This is why sudden hatred feels disproportionate. You might have done nothing directly offensive, yet someone begins to treat you coldly, gossip behind your back, or exclude you from social circles. To understand this, Jung reminds us that the psyche operates symbolically. You become a symbol of their shadow. You are no longer just yourself. You represent their denied ambition, their hidden shame, or their suppressed desires. Hatred erupts because facing you is equivalent to facing themselves, and the psyche instinctively resists that confrontation. Take another example. In a group of friends, one person decides to start therapy or pursue spiritual growth. Initially, the group might be curious, even supportive, but as changes become visible, the person becomes calmer, more authentic, less interested in shallow drama. Others may start to resent them. Why? Because their transformation indirectly exposes the stagnation of the group. Jung would interpret this as the collective shadow at work. It's not just an individual projection, but a shared defense against growth. The group unconsciously agrees to resist change by scapegoating the one who evolves, turning admiration into sudden hatred. The silent war emerges here. Jung emphasized that the unconscious does not always act with open aggression. Instead, it manipulates through subtle signals: exclusion, sarcasm, coldness, passive-aggressive remarks. These are not accidents. They are symptoms of psychic tension. To the one being hated, this war feels invisible yet palpable. You may sense the shift in energy before you even see behavioral changes. This is because the psyche communicates in symbolic language, and emotional hostility often precedes verbal or behavioral confirmation. One might ask, why does the psyche choose hatred instead of indifference? Indifference would seem easier after all. Ignoring someone requires less energy than maintaining hostility. But Jung observed that when the shadow is projected, it cannot be neutral. It carries emotional charge because it represents repressed psychic material. Hatred is the intensity of that charge released outward. In other words, hatred is rarely about the other person's objective qualities. It is about the unconscious weight they carry for the hater. Consider how this plays out in intimate relationships. A partner who once adored your spontaneity may suddenly start criticizing it as irresponsibility. A friend who admired your honesty may later accuse you of being harsh or insensitive. These sudden flips are not simply changes of opinion, they are evidence of projection. At first, your traits fulfilled a hidden longing in them. Later, those same traits awaken the shadow they resist. Jung believed this ambivalence is inevitable in human relationships. Love and hate are two sides of the same psychic projection. The shift from one to the other happens when the unconscious balance tips. There is also a collective cultural dimension. Societies often elevate individuals as heroes or icons, only to later tear them down with public disdain. Jung would interpret this as the archetypal cycle of projection and retraction. The hero archetype is admired because it embodies collective aspirations. But once the hero's presence reminds society of its own failings, the shadow turns against them. Sudden hatred in this sense is not personal but archetypal. It reflects the collective psyche managing its contradictions. What makes this phenomenon especially painful is its unpredictability. People often feel blindsided when they become targets of sudden dislike. They question themselves endlessly. What did I do wrong? Why did they change? But Jung would caution against over-rationalizing. The psyche's movements are not always logical. They are symbolic, archetypal, and deeply unconscious. The hatred may have little to do with your actions and everything to do with the psychic material you unknowingly represent. Yet being on the receiving end of this hostility can be destabilizing. Jung recognized the danger of identifying too strongly with projections. If someone projects their shadow onto you as the villain, you may unconsciously begin to act it out, embodying the very traits they accuse you of. This is called identification with the projection. The hated person internalizes the role and begins to live it, creating a vicious cycle. Breaking this cycle requires conscious awareness, realizing that much of the hatred directed at you is not truly about you. In modern terms, sudden hatred often plays out in social media dynamics. A celebrity or influencer can be adored one day and cancelled the next. The collective projection is visible in real time. Admiration turns to hatred with shocking speed. Jung's framework explains this better than rational analysis of events. What we are witnessing is the collective shadow erupting, with the figure in question serving as its container. The hatred is not simply about a mistake they made, it is about what they symbolize in the unconscious psyche of the crowd. This is why Jung's insights remain so relevant today. Sudden hatred is not a glitch in human behavior. It is an inevitable outcome of projection and shadow dynamics. Whenever someone stands out, grows, or embodies traits others repress, they risk becoming a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous because they force people to confront what they most want to avoid. The pain of this phenomenon lies in its invisibility. You rarely see the psychological process happening. You only see the results, the cold looks, the whispered gossip, the unexplained hostility. It feels like a war you never signed up for, a silent war, where the battlefield is the unconscious mind. But understanding Jung's psychology transforms this pain into insight. You begin to see that the hatred is less about your failure and more about the other's refusal to face their own shadow. And so the first step in navigating sudden hatred is recognition. Recognition that human emotions are not purely rational, that the unconscious rules more than we realize, and that you may be hated not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. To be suddenly hated is to be caught in someone else's unconscious struggle to become the unwilling symbol of their denied truths. Part 2. The reflection of the shadow and why others see you as a threat. When Jung spoke about the shadow, he did not describe it as a minor psychological inconvenience. He described it as one of the most powerful and disruptive forces in the human psyche. The shadow is the collection of everything we deny, repress, or fail to acknowledge about ourselves. Anger, jealousy, greed, fear, lust, weakness, ambition, or even positive qualities we were told were unacceptable. The shadow is the dark twin of our conscious personality, and it is always present whether we like it or not. When people suddenly begin to hate you, it is often because you have become a mirror of their shadow, reflecting back to them what they cannot accept within themselves. Projection is the central mechanism here. Jung explained projection as the unconscious act of attributing one's own disowned traits onto another person. Instead of admitting "I am envious," the psyche says, "That person is arrogant, selfish, undeserving." Instead of admitting "I crave recognition," the psyche declares, "They're just attention-seeking." Hatred emerges because it feels easier to despise another person than to face the truth within. In other words, when someone hates you, they are often hating the part of themselves they cannot tolerate. Consider an example: a man who suppresses his aggression because he was raised to believe that anger is unacceptable. He spends years building an image of himself as calm, reasonable, and gentle. Then he meets someone who speaks with confidence, asserts boundaries, and shows flashes of righteous anger when needed. Instead of admiring this, he feels an inexplicable dislike. He labels the person as hostile or toxic, but in reality what he despises is his own buried aggression, the part of himself he refuses to see. The other person becomes a screen for his projection. Jung would say that this is the shadow alive and operating outside his awareness. This is why you often trigger hatred by simply being yourself. Your very existence can activate the shadow in others. If you are authentic in ways they cannot be, if you embody freedom they suppress, or if you succeed where they secretly feel inadequate, you become a psychological threat. Not a physical threat, but an existential one. You force them to confront the discrepancy between who they are and who they wish they were. Hatred becomes their shield against this painful awareness. One of Jung's most striking observations is that the shadow contains not only negative traits but also positive potential. For example, someone who was discouraged from showing ambition as a child may repress their drive to succeed. Later in life, when they encounter a person who pursues goals with passion and confidence, they might resent or even hate them. The hatred here is not about arrogance or pride, but about the projection of their own repressed ambition. The other person is hated precisely because they embody the unlived life within the observer. Jung called this the gold in the shadow, the potential we deny, and then project outward. This helps explain why hatred often feels irrational. You may ask yourself, why do they hate me? I did nothing to them. The truth is, you did not need to. By embodying certain qualities, courage, creativity, authenticity, independence, you are unconsciously exposing what they lack. Your existence alone is enough to awaken their shadow. This is why hatred often emerges in places where no direct conflict exists, within families, friendships, workplaces, or communities, where on the surface there should be harmony. Take the family example. A younger sibling may grow up in the shadow of an older one who excels academically or socially. Even if the younger sibling is kind and supportive, resentment may develop. Why? Because the sibling's success mirrors the younger one's unacknowledged feelings of inadequacy. Instead of admitting to envy, the psyche chooses the easier path, hatred. Jung warned that unresolved sibling rivalries are fertile ground for shadow projection, leading to lifelong hostility that feels inexplicable on the surface. The workplace provides another fertile example. Imagine a team where one individual takes initiative, speaks up with confidence, and contributes innovative ideas. At first, colleagues might praise this, but soon whispers start. They think they're smarter than everyone else. They're just trying to impress the boss. Behind these remarks lies the collective shadow of the group, their own suppressed creativity, their fear of being overlooked, their reluctance to step outside comfort zones. Hatred arises not because the individual is wrong, but because they embody what the others repress. Jung would call this a constellation of the shadow, a group projection that turns a single person into a symbolic enemy. The phenomenon is intensified by archetypes. Jung believed that projection often activates archetypal images stored in the collective unconscious. For example, when someone embodies independence and confidence, they may unconsciously be cast into the role of the rebel archetype. To those who fear rebellion within themselves, this person becomes dangerous. Similarly, if someone radiates wisdom or authenticity, they might be projected upon as the prophet archetype. The prophet archetype is both admired and feared because it carries the weight of truth that others would rather avoid. When you embody such archetypes unconsciously, you trigger both fascination and hatred in those around you. This is why people may suddenly start to see you as a threat, even when you have no intention of harming them. To the unconscious, threat does not mean physical danger, it means psychic exposure. By your presence, you expose what others would prefer to keep hidden, and since they cannot fight their own unconscious, they fight you instead. Jung noted that the greater your authenticity, the more you risk triggering projection. People who conform, suppress, and hide rarely attract intense hatred. They may remain invisible, unthreatening to others' fragile egos. But those who dare to express themselves, who step into individuality and differentiation, inevitably disturb the collective psyche. Hatred is the price of individuation. This is why Jung said, "The more you become who you are, the more alone you may feel." Hatred from others is often the shadow's resistance to your authenticity. It is important to realize that projection is not only one-sided. When others project their shadow onto you, you are tempted to respond with your own projection. If someone hates you without cause, your instinct might be to label them as jealous, insecure, or toxic. While this may be true, it can also be your own projection, your refusal to see how their reaction might reflect something within yourself. Jung believed that relationships are mirrors facing each other, and both sides are projecting. The challenge is to discern which parts belong to you and which belong to them. What makes projection so dangerous is that it dehumanizes the other person. When someone projects their shadow onto you, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a symbol. You become the arrogant one, the enemy, the threat. They strip away your complexity and replace it with a caricature of their own psyche. This is why sudden hatred feels so alienating. People are no longer relating to you as a human being, but to a distorted image of themselves reflected in you. This distortion explains why hatred escalates quickly. Once you are cast into the role of the enemy, every action you take is interpreted through that lens. A joke is seen as mockery, success as arrogance, kindness as manipulation. The projection filters perception, turning neutral events into evidence of hostility. Jung described this as the autonomous complex. Once activated, it has a life of its own. The person no longer chooses to hate you. They are possessed by the projection. Their psyche has constructed a story, and you are trapped in it whether you want to be or not. The irony is that the traits they despise are often the ones they secretly desire. The person who calls you arrogant may secretly long for the courage to speak confidently. The one who labels you selfish may desperately need to set boundaries themselves. Jung emphasized that projection is often admiration in disguise. What looks like hatred is frequently envy twisted into hostility to avoid shame. In this way, hatred reveals not only what someone fears, but also what they crave. For those who find themselves the target of such hatred, Jung would advise awareness and differentiation. Recognize that when someone treats you as a threat, it is not necessarily about your actions, but about what you represent to their unconscious. Resist the urge to retaliate with your own projection. Instead, maintain clarity. This is their shadow at work, not my identity. By holding this perspective, you prevent yourself from internalizing the hostility. You refuse to become the villain in their psychic drama. At its core, Sudden hatred is the psyche's attempt to avoid self-confrontation. People fear facing their own shadow, so they outsource the battle to others. They make you the battlefield, the scapegoat, the vessel of their denied truths. Jung's psychology helps us see this clearly. Hatred is not random but deeply symbolic. And once you understand this, you can navigate the hostility with wisdom instead of confusion, strength instead of despair. Part 3. Shifts in energy and the process of individuation. One of Jung's most profound contributions to psychology is the idea of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming one's true self by integrating the conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, nor is it about conforming to cultural ideals. It is about wholeness. Yet paradoxically, the closer someone comes to wholeness, the more resistance they often encounter from those around them. This is because individuation alters the psychic energy field of a person, and that change disrupts the balance of groups and relationships in ways that others experience as threatening. Jung believed that human beings are not isolated entities, but are constantly exchanging psychic energy. The unconscious is not a closed system. It leaks, it influences, it projects, it resonates. This is why we can often feel when someone has changed, even if they have not said a word. Their presence radiates differently. Their silence communicates as loudly as their speech. And when someone begins to individuate, the energy they emit destabilizes the unconscious agreements that hold social groups together. In most communities, there is an unspoken contract of sameness. People unconsciously agree to operate within certain boundaries of behavior, thought, and aspiration. These boundaries create comfort. Nobody rises too high, nobody falls too low, but individuation shatters that contract. When a person begins to integrate their shadow, embrace their authentic desires, and live with greater consciousness, they no longer fit neatly into the group's psychic mold. This difference in energy is not neutral. It challenges others to face what they have avoided in themselves. And rather than confront their own limitations, many people respond with hostility. Consider the example of someone who begins therapy or a spiritual practice. At first, their friends may be curious, even supportive. But as the individual's energy shifts, becoming calmer, clearer, less reactive, the group dynamic changes. Old jokes no longer amuse them. Gossip feels empty. Drama no longer draws them in. Their detachment is not meant as judgment, but others interpret it that way. The group senses a loss of control because the individuating person is no longer playing by the same unconscious rules. Hostility arises as a defense. You think you're better than us, or you've changed. What has truly changed is not superiority but energy, the vibration of someone aligning with their deeper self. Jung explained that individuation often involves withdrawing projections and reclaiming psychic energy that was previously scattered across relationships. This reclamation makes a person feel more centered, more authentic, and more whole, but to others it feels like abandonment. When you stop carrying other people's projections, when you refuse to be their scapegoat, their caretaker, their mirror, they experience loss. They may not consciously understand it, but unconsciously they feel threatened. Hatred then is not about you doing harm, but about you no longer playing a role that sustained their own unconscious balance. Energy shifts also disturb archetypal patterns in groups. For instance, many social systems unconsciously assign archetypal roles. One person becomes the caretaker, another the rebel, another the comic relief. These roles allow the group to function without self-examination. But when someone individuates, they break out of the archetype assigned to them. The caretaker may stop overgiving, the rebel may find inner peace, the comic may start speaking seriously. This archetypal shift destabilizes the entire group, because others relied on the individual staying in role. The result is often resentment. You're not who you used to be. Jung would say the resentment is not about the individual's growth, but about the group's refusal to adapt. Individuation also requires confronting personal darkness, and that confrontation generates a kind of psychic intensity. Jung described this as encountering the numinous, the mysterious, overwhelming power of the unconscious. People in individuation radiate this intensity, and others unconsciously sense it. Sometimes it draws admiration, but often it provokes discomfort. People feel something different about you, too intense, too unsettling, too unpredictable. The energy is not malicious, but it forces others to face the possibility that life could be lived differently. And for many, that possibility is terrifying. This is why individuation often leads to isolation. Jung wrote that individuation is not a collective path, but a solitary one because it demands differentiation from the herd. To individuate is to break away from unconscious identification with the crowd, to accept the loneliness of authenticity. But the loneliness is compounded by hostility. Others not only drift away but actively resist your transformation. They may criticize, mock, or even attack, not because you harmed them, but because your energy shift reveals their own stagnation. Energy shifts can be subtle yet powerful. For instance, when you set boundaries where you previously had none, people feel it before you speak it. They sense they can no longer manipulate or control you, and their unconscious reacts with anger. When you stop participating in gossip, people feel judged even if you said nothing. Your silence alone disrupts the group's shadow activity. When you choose creative or spiritual pursuits over empty distractions, others feel left behind. Jung would argue that what they feel is the activation of their own shadow, the awareness that they too could change but refuse to. Another critical element in individuation is the confrontation with the anima or animus, the inner feminine in men and inner masculine in women. This confrontation balances the psyche, producing a more integrated personality. But integration makes a person radiate a different energy, more whole, less dependent, less easy to manipulate. In relationships, this can be threatening. A woman who integrates her animus may no longer tolerate a partner's control. A man who integrates his anima may express vulnerability that unsettles traditional expectations. Both may face hostility not because they are wrong, but because their integration exposes the one-sidedness of others. Individuation also involves opening to the self, the archetype of totality that transcends ego. When a person begins to embody the self, they often carry an aura of authority or wisdom, even without trying. Others may unconsciously project onto them the archetype of the wise one or prophet. This projection is double-edged. Some admire it, but others resent it. To be around someone aligned with the self can feel like standing in front of a mirror that reveals all your flaws. Hatred arises not because the individuated person judges, but because their very presence judges, simply by existing as a contrast. Jung warned that the individuation process is dangerous precisely because of this social backlash. The more one individuates, the more one risks becoming an outsider. Not because they have withdrawn, but because others push them out. This is the paradox of psychological growth. The more whole you become, the more alien you appear to those who remain fragmented. Your energy no longer fits the group's unconscious template, and the group defends itself by rejecting you. To illustrate this, consider historical figures who embodied individuation: prophets, visionaries, reformers. They were rarely welcomed in their own communities. Often they were hated, mocked, or even killed. Why? Because their energy represented a future others were not ready to face. Jung would interpret this as the archetypal pattern of the rejected prophet. The one who individuates ahead of their time inevitably meets resistance. The hatred they provoke is the psyche's resistance to transformation played out collectively. The individual undergoing individuation must therefore develop resilience. Jung emphasized that individuation is not about pleasing others but about aligning with the self. Hatred from others is painful, but it is also confirmation you are breaking the unconscious contract of sameness, stepping into your unique wholeness. The hostility you face is the shadow's attempt to pull you back into conformity. Recognizing this gives strength. You realize the hatred is not a sign you are wrong, but a sign you are different. And difference is the essence of individuation. In essence, the energy shift of individuation creates a psychic disturbance. Others may not consciously understand it, but they feel it. They feel exposed, destabilized, even betrayed. And because they cannot articulate the discomfort, they convert it into hostility. Jung helps us see that this hostility is not personal, it is archetypal, a predictable response of the unconscious to transformation. Part 4. The Silent War: Unconscious Mechanisms in Relationships. When Jung explored the dynamics of the unconscious, he emphasized that its operations are often invisible yet deeply impactful. Human beings rarely declare war openly in the realm of personal relationships. Instead, conflicts unfold in silence beneath the surface through subtle signals, passive-aggressive behaviors, and unspoken hostility. Jung's psychology reveals that what feels like a silent war is in fact the unconscious at work, expressing itself indirectly when conscious acknowledgement is too threatening. The unconscious resists exposure. This resistance explains why hatred, envy, or resentment often appear not as direct confrontation but as quiet sabotage. People avoid explicit hostility because that would require admitting uncomfortable emotions such as jealousy or insecurity. Instead, the psyche disguises hostility in symbolic gestures, a cold glance, withheld support, dismissive remarks, or exclusion from the group. These behaviors may seem minor on the surface, but they carry immense psychic weight. To the sensitive individual, they feel like attacks even if no words are spoken. Jung described this as the shadow play, the way hidden parts of the psyche express themselves indirectly. In relationships, shadow play creates wars that are never openly declared. You may sense you are being targeted, yet when you confront others, they deny it. "I'm not angry. You're imagining things." This denial deepens the confusion because your intuition perceives hostility, but your rational mind cannot confirm it. Jung would argue that this dissonance is precisely the work of the unconscious. It thrives in ambiguity, keeping conflicts unresolved and festering. Projection again plays a central role. When someone projects their shadow onto you, they often cannot admit it even to themselves. To hate you directly would mean facing their own envy or insecurity. So the unconscious takes control and orchestrates subtle strategies to push you away while maintaining the illusion of innocence. This is the essence of the silent war. You are attacked, not with weapons but with invisibility, with ambiguity, with denial. The collective unconscious intensifies this phenomenon in groups. Jung observed that groups often operate with a hive-like psyche, where individuals surrender part of their consciousness to collective dynamics. In such settings, hostility can spread without words. One person's projection infects the group, and suddenly you are cast in the role of the outsider, the enemy, or the problem. No one may openly accuse you, yet the collective behavior shifts conversations. Stop when you enter invitations. Vanish. Your contributions are ignored. The group unconsciously agrees to wage a silent war. This mechanism is archetypal. Jung identified recurring symbolic roles in the unconscious and in the silent war. One common archetype is the scapegoat. The scapegoat carries the group's unwanted qualities, absorbing the projections of fear, envy, and shame. By targeting you, the group temporarily relieves itself of inner tension. But the relief is only temporary because the root, the shadow within, remains unintegrated. This is why scapegoating often cycles. When one target leaves, another is chosen. The silent war is not about the individual, but about the group's refusal to face itself. The archetype of the outsider is also relevant. In Jungian terms, the outsider symbolizes what does not conform, what challenges the collective identity. When you individuate, when your energy shifts, your values change, or you refuse to play assigned roles, you unconsciously activate the outsider archetype. To groups that fear difference, you represent chaos, danger, disruption. They may not articulate this consciously, but unconsciously they treat you as a threat to their cohesion. The silent war becomes their attempt to neutralize your difference without openly confronting it. This unconscious hostility often manifests in symbolic forms. For example, silence itself is a weapon. Silence communicates exclusion, rejection, or disapproval without ever needing words. Another symbol is mockery disguised as humor jokes that cut deeper than they seem. Jung taught that symbols are the language of the unconscious, so these behaviors are not random. They are the psyche's way of expressing aggression without admitting it. To the target, these symbolic acts feel confusing and destabilizing precisely because they bypass rational communication. The silent war also operates through what Jung called complexes. Complexes are clusters of emotional energy organized around past traumas or unresolved experiences. When a complex is activated, it behaves autonomously, almost like a separate personality. If someone has an inferiority complex, for example, your success might unconsciously activate it. They may then treat you with hostility without understanding why. The war is not really between you and them. It is between you and their complex, between your presence and their unresolved wounds. This explains why their hostility feels disproportionate, even irrational. Another mechanism at play is the fear of individuation itself. Jung believed most people resist individuation because it threatens the safety of conformity. When someone near them begins to individuate, it unconsciously awakens their own fear. What if I too must face my shadow? What if I too must change? Rather than confront these fears, they direct aggression toward the individuating person. The silent war is their unconscious defense against transformation. By targeting you, they protect their own illusion of stability. What makes the silent war particularly damaging is its invisibility. Open conflict can be addressed, negotiated, resolved, but silent conflict erodes from within. The target begins to doubt their own perceptions. Am I imagining this? Am I too sensitive? Jung warned that this doubt is dangerous because it splits the psyche. When your intuition perceives hostility but your rational mind dismisses it, you experience inner division. Over time, this can lead to anxiety, depression, or self-doubt. The silent war thus wounds not through direct attack but through psychic dissonance. In intimate relationships, the silent war is especially destructive. Couples may stop communicating openly, replacing words with sarcasm, withdrawal, or passive aggression. Friends may smile to each other's faces while secretly competing or resenting. Families may ostracize one member through unspoken exclusion. Jung would interpret all these as the unconscious refusing confrontation. Instead of integrating shadow material, envy, anger, disappointment, the psyche externalizes it in subtle hostilities. The war is waged not to resolve but to avoid resolution. Archetypally, the silent war also connects to the trickster figure. The trickster represents deception, mischief, and indirectness. When the trickster archetype is activated in the unconscious, conflicts become distorted. People say one thing but mean another. They pretend to support you while secretly undermining you. The trickster thrives in ambiguity, creating confusion and mistrust. To Jung, the presence of the trickster in relationships signals that the unconscious is manipulating events, turning communication into illusion. The silent war is not only interpersonal but intrapsychic. Often, when you are the target of such hostility, your own shadow is triggered. You may begin to feel anger, resentment, or bitterness. These emotions, if unacknowledged, can lead you to unconsciously retaliate in equally subtle ways. Jung would caution here, if you fight a silent war with silence, you become ensnared in the unconscious drama. The challenge is to maintain consciousness, to resist sinking into shadow play, and to engage with awareness rather than reaction. One of Jung's most important insights is that the unconscious seeks wholeness even through conflict. The silent war, as destructive as it feels, is also an invitation to see, to integrate, to become aware. It reveals where projections are active, where complexes control behavior, and where individuation is resisted. To recognize the silent war is to recognize the unconscious in action. This recognition transforms confusion into clarity and hostility into an opportunity for self-knowledge. Part 5. The psychological impact on the individual, the price of awakening. When someone suddenly becomes the target of hatred, the experience rarely feels rational. It is often bewildering, destabilizing, and profoundly painful. Jung understood this not only as a social phenomenon, but as a deep psychological wound. To be hated without cause, or to be cast as the enemy in someone else's unconscious drama, strikes at the core of the psyche. The experience activates our most primitive fears: abandonment, rejection, and exile from the collective. Jung would say that the hatred we encounter from others is often the crucible through which individuation is tested, but it is also the source of tremendous psychological suffering. At the surface level, sudden hatred disrupts the individual's sense of identity. You may ask yourself endlessly, what did I do wrong? Why do they hate me? What changed? This questioning is natural, but it can easily spiral into self-doubt. Jung warned that when the unconscious projects onto us, we risk internalizing those projections. If someone casts you as arrogant, selfish, or untrustworthy, you may unconsciously begin to wonder if it is true. This is what Jung called identification with the projection. You take on the shadow that others have projected, and in doing so you lose touch with your authentic self. This inner conflict can be devastating. On one hand, your intuition tells you that the hatred is irrational. On the other, your rational mind searches for reasons, and failing to find them turns inward, concluding that the fault must be yours. This split creates psychic dissonance, a tearing between inner knowing and outer perception. Jung described such dissonance as dangerous because it fragments the ego and makes the individual vulnerable to neurosis. To carry the weight of another's unconscious projection without awareness is to risk losing yourself in their shadow. The impact is intensified by the primal nature of exclusion. Human beings are wired for belonging. From the earliest tribal societies, survival depended on acceptance within the group. Exile meant death. This ancestral memory still lives in the collective unconscious. When you are hated, ignored, or ostracized, it triggers not only personal pain but archetypal fear. You feel like the outcast, the one cast from the tribe. Jung would remind us that this role is archetypal. It carries both suffering and meaning. Yet the suffering is real, and it can manifest as loneliness, depression, or a sense of abandonment by life itself. The process of awakening the confrontation with the unconscious, the pursuit of individuation, inevitably heightens this pain. Jung often noted that individuation is not a pleasant journey. It requires confronting the shadow, enduring solitude, and accepting the loss of old identities. Hatred from others is part of this initiation. It is the price of awakening. As you align with your deeper self, you disturb the unconscious agreements that once secured your belonging. Others resist this disturbance, and their resistance comes in the form of rejection. What they cannot tolerate in themselves, they project onto you. For many, this leads to what mystics call the dark night of the soul. Jung did not use this phrase explicitly, but his writings echo its meaning. The dark night is the period of isolation and despair, when everything familiar collapses. Friends turn into strangers, relationships disintegrate, communities withdraw. You feel stripped of external validation, left alone with only your psyche. Jung would say that this is not punishment but initiation. The dark night forces you to withdraw projections, to stop depending on others for identity, and to anchor yourself in the self, the deeper totality of your being. This process, however, is psychologically excruciating. To be suddenly hated is to face the terror of invisibility and hypervisibility at the same time. You are invisible because people no longer see you for who you are. They see only their projections. You are hyper-visible because every action you take is scrutinized, judged, and distorted. This paradox traps the psyche in tension. Jung believed that such tension is necessary for growth, but he acknowledged its pain. Growth often begins with wounds, and wounds are inflicted when others attack you for embodying truths they cannot bear. One of the most profound psychological effects is the temptation to withdraw entirely. When you are hated, your instinct may be to retreat, to isolate, to protect yourself from further harm. While some withdrawal is healthy, Jung cautioned against total isolation. The danger is that withdrawal can turn into avoidance, preventing integration. If hatred from others drives you into bitterness or cynicism, you risk becoming trapped in your own shadow. The challenge is to differentiate between healthy solitude, necessary for individuation, and pathological isolation, which hardens the psyche and prevents connection. Another impact is the erosion of trust. When people you once relied on suddenly turn against you, it undermines your ability to trust not only others but yourself. You may question your judgment. If I misread them, what else am I misreading? Jung understood this as a confrontation with the trickster archetype. The trickster brings chaos, uncertainty, and deception. When the trickster is active, reality feels unreliable. People say one thing and mean another. Friends become enemies without warning. To navigate this archetypal energy requires humility, accepting that certainty is an illusion and learning to trust inner guidance over external approval. The psychological toll can also manifest somatically. Jung noted that the psyche expresses itself through the body when the conscious mind refuses to listen. People under the stress of sudden hatred may develop anxiety, insomnia, digestive issues, or other psychosomatic symptoms. These are not random. They are the body carrying the weight of unintegrated psychic conflict. To heal requires not only medical attention, but also psychological awareness, recognizing that the body is speaking the language of the unconscious, demanding that the conflict be faced consciously. And yet Jung insisted that the pain of being hated is not meaningless. It is symbolic. To be rejected by others is often to be chosen by the self. In archetypal terms, the hatred of the crowd pushes the individual onto the path of the hero or the prophet. Heroes are rarely celebrated in their own time. Prophets are often persecuted. Their rejection is not personal but archetypal. It reflects the resistance of the collective unconscious to transformation. When you are hated for awakening, you are walking a path that countless figures before you have walked. You are bearing the cross of individuation. This realization does not erase the pain, but it reframes it. Instead of asking, "Why do they hate me?" you begin to ask, "What truth in me threatens them? What shadow in them am I reflecting?" This shift transforms hatred from a wound into a mirror. The hostility of others becomes an indicator of your own growth. Jung would say that when you provoke the shadow, it is often because you are carrying light. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow it casts. Still, the individual must cultivate resilience. Jung emphasized the need for a strong ego, not an inflated ego, but a grounded one to withstand the storms of projection. Without a stable ego, you risk being swallowed by others' shadows. With a strong ego, you can endure hatred without internalizing it. You can say, "This is their unconscious at work. It does not define me." Such resilience allows you to remain on the path of individuation, even when the world resists. Ultimately, the psychological impact of sudden hatred is profound. It wounds, isolates, and destabilizes. But in Jung's framework, it is also transformative. Hatred is the fire that burns away false identities, forcing you to discover a deeper foundation within yourself. The price of awakening is loneliness, but the reward is authenticity. To survive the hatred of others is to prove that your identity is no longer dependent on collective approval, but anchored in the self. And this anchoring is the essence of individuation. Part 6. Overcoming silent hatred and anchoring the self. Jung taught that the human psyche is not designed to remain trapped in projection forever. The unconscious seeks integration, yet the path toward integration is rarely smooth. When you find yourself the object of sudden hatred, you stand at a crossroads. On one side lies collapse, internalizing the hatred, becoming bitter, retaliating unconsciously, or allowing yourself to shrink. On the other lies transformation, using the hostility as a mirror to understand both yourself and others more deeply. To choose transformation requires conscious effort because the unconscious always tempts us toward regression. Jung believed the task of individuation is to resist regression to move toward wholeness even when the world pushes you into fragmentation. The first step in overcoming silent hatred is recognition. Recognition that much of what others project onto you is not your burden to carry. Jung wrote that projection is like a piece of the psyche split off and hung onto someone else. If you accept it as your identity, you become trapped in someone else's shadow. If you recognize it for what it is, you remain free. This does not mean ignoring hostility or pretending it does not hurt. It means maintaining inner clarity. This is their unconscious material, not mine. Such clarity preserves the ego from being swallowed by collective projection. At the same time, individuation demands that you do not deny your own shadow. If hatred triggers anger, resentment, or fear within you, those emotions must also be acknowledged. To repress them would only create more shadow. Jung urged that the shadow must be integrated, not eradicated. When you integrate your anger, you gain strength without becoming destructive. When you integrate your fear, you gain caution without paralysis. In this way, the hostility of others becomes a catalyst for your own integration. You learn not only who they are, but who you are under pressure. Anchoring in the self is the deeper task. For Jung, the self is the archetype of wholeness, the center that transcends the ego. When you are hated, the ego naturally wavers, craving validation, fearing rejection, doubting its own worth. Only by aligning with the self can you withstand the storm. The self provides a sense of meaning that does not depend on external approval. It whispers, "Your value is intrinsic, not given by others." This anchoring transforms hatred from a personal wound into a collective drama you are temporarily caught within. You realize you are not the villain others imagine. You are simply carrying an energy they cannot yet integrate. One of the most effective ways to anchor in the self is through solitude. Solitude is not the same as isolation. Isolation is fueled by bitterness and fear. Solitude is chosen as a space for reflection and growth. Jung himself spent long periods in solitude, especially during the years he confronted his own unconscious visions, later recorded in the Red Book. In solitude, he learned that the psyche speaks in symbols, dreams, and images. When you are hated, solitude gives you the silence to listen inwardly instead of being consumed by the noise of projections. It becomes a sanctuary where the self can emerge. Another practice Jung emphasized is the confrontation with archetypes. When others hate you, they may unconsciously cast you into roles: the villain, the rebel, the outsider. To survive, you must resist identifying with these archetypes. Instead, you must discover your own archetypal pattern. Perhaps you are walking the path of the hero enduring trials to discover strength. Perhaps you embody the sage carrying wisdom that others are not ready to hear. By consciously engaging archetypes, you reclaim agency over the narrative. You say, "I am not their projection. I am participating in a deeper myth of transformation." Forgiveness is also a critical part of transcending hatred, though Jung would frame it differently than moralistic traditions. For Jung, forgiveness is not about excusing others, but about withdrawing projection. When you forgive, you no longer carry their shadow as your burden. You refuse to let their unconscious define your inner life. Forgiveness in this sense is a psychological act of liberation. It allows you to walk free of the silent war, not because others have changed, but because you have refused to become entangled in their complexes. Another tool is boundary setting. Jung understood boundaries not just as social practices, but as psychic necessities. When you individuate, you naturally create psychic boundaries. You no longer absorb projections without question. But in practical terms, this also means learning when to disengage from toxic environments, when to walk away from relationships that cannot handle your authenticity, and when to protect your energy. Boundaries are not rejection of others, they are affirmation of yourself. They communicate, "I am not here to carry what is yours, I will carry only what is mine." Creativity is yet another pathway. Jung emphasized that the unconscious finds expression not only in pathology but also in art, writing, music, and imagination. When you are hated, you are carrying enormous psychic energy, both yours and others. If this energy is not expressed consciously, it turns inward, producing anxiety or depression. Creativity provides an outlet. To paint, to write, to dance, to speak, these are ways of transforming projection into expression. You take what was meant as hostility and turn it into meaning. Jung would say that this is the alchemical task, turning the lead of suffering into the gold of insight. The process of overcoming hatred also requires patience. Jung wrote that individuation unfolds over a lifetime. It cannot be rushed. Hatred from others may persist for years, sometimes decades. The temptation is to fight back, to prove yourself, to demand recognition, but often this only entangles you further in the projections. Jung encouraged instead the virtue of waiting. In time, projections fade, truths emerge, and relationships evolve. To endure without collapsing is itself a form of victory. The silent war loses power when you refuse to participate in it unconsciously. The archetype of the wounded healer is especially relevant here. Jung noted that those who suffer most often become healers because their wounds force them to seek meaning. When you endure hatred, you learn empathy for others who are marginalized, misunderstood, or rejected. You develop resilience, insight, and compassion. The very wound that once threatened to destroy you becomes the source of your strength. The wounded healer does not deny pain but transforms it into wisdom. In this way, hatred becomes not only a personal trial but also a collective gift. Ultimately, overcoming silent hatred means recognizing that you cannot control the unconscious of others. You cannot force them to integrate their shadow. You cannot stop them from projecting. What you can do is remain conscious, integrate your own shadow, and align with the self. Jung's psychology teaches that the task is not to eliminate conflict, but to use it as a path toward wholeness. When you refuse to collapse under projection, you demonstrate the power of individuation. You become an example not by preaching, but by embodying authenticity despite opposition. This is why Jung believed that individuation is both a personal and a collective act. When one person individuates, they disturb the collective unconscious, but they also plant seeds. Others may hate you now, but unconsciously they are also influenced by your authenticity. Your presence becomes a mirror they cannot forget. Perhaps years later they will remember the one who dared to be different, and in that memory they will find courage to face their own shadow. Hatred then is not the end of the story, but part of the archetypal journey of transformation. If people suddenly turn against you, remember their hatred is often the reflection of their own shadow. Your growth threatens their comfort, but it confirms your awakening. Stay anchored in your true self. Let me know in the comments, have you experienced this silent war? And don't forget to subscribe for more deep insights into the psychology of the unconscious.